We've all heard about skeletons in the closet growing up, but some of us had something a bit more ghastly in our closets. People all around the world have experienced unknown and unexplained happenings that defy all logic. From haunted dolls to Ouija boards gone wrong, these stories sent in by subscribers will freak you out. If you would like to submit your own experience to be shared on a future episode, send it on in at swampdweller.net. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. Now, let's get into these truly creepy stories. One of my hobbies is collecting and customizing ball-jointed dolls. It's kind of a snobby community, so I stick to myself. Though, my dolls creep out others, but I've never had any paranormal issues with them. I mostly bought them new, and nothing has been attached. That is only one of my doll-related hobbies. I also enjoy going to used stores and looking at knickknacks where I have found some pretty cool old little dolls. On one trip I went to Value Village and headed straight to the back where all of the little items were bagged because that's where the good deals are. Scanning the wall, one of the baggies caught my eye. There were 5 little dolls in it. There were these little crocheted ones with buttons for faces, 2 rubber Hansel and Gretel looking ones. Then this clown doll, which seemed out of place. I only wanted the 4 dolls, not really a fan of clowns. It was only $3 for the 5 of them, and I figured I would give away the clown when I got home. When something is attached to something, I can physically feel it when I touch it. It's almost like there's this bubble around the item that my hand passes through. I got a flash of color and anxiety shoots up my arm, then my chest. It feels like a lump of anxiousness just sitting there. At that point, I knew there was something attached to one of them and decided to bring them home. One by one I picked up each doll. They all had a little something attached, but when I got to the clown, it was really strong. I took a picture of her and started asking if anyone wanted her. No one wanted to take her. Everyone told me to just donate her back. Weird things had already been happening around my house, so I figured there was no harm in waiting to get rid of the little doll. I'm not sure what is attached to the doll, but it's very angry and loud. It bangs on the wall, the doors, shelves, and I haven't slept properly in ages. I keep the lights on because it seems to help. It harassed me every night and eventually I got sick of it. One night, it crept up beside my bed, hitting it from underneath. I opened my eyes from a deep sleep, leaned towards it and yelled, "Screw off!" It must have been pretty startled because ever since then it hasn't been as bad. If it's dark it'll start banging around. Not as loud as it used to be though. It used to hide in my closet, but has since moved to the basement, in the corner of the laundry room and watches from behind the furnace. People have told me to get rid of it, but as long as it's behaving I honestly don't mind it being here. I ignored it for a while, but maybe it's time to communicate and see what it wants. I'm a Native American from a reservation in Michigan. In my younger years, me and my close friend, I will call her M, decided to go back to our roots and get some snares. And in the northern Michigan winter, there is snow and cold. This was so long ago, however, I remember we wanted to utilize not only the meat for dinner, but the hide for regalia. We decided to go south into a swampy area that had cedar and pines. We were looking for pathways the rabbits used to set the snares when we noticed a clearing that seemed to have no snow. We both agreed to proceed towards what we saw. We both were getting creepy vibes as we approached the site, and when I entered the circle I saw jars with things in all around them. The freakiest thing was in the middle of this was a tree, which upon the vines grew toward the ground. Then, there in the fork of this tree was a doll, arms raised. The trees, seemed to make a natural cove around this place, and I just wanted to get out of there. I had extreme butterflies and wanted to bolt. I and M didn't touch anything and proceeded home as fast as we could through the snow without shoes. After we reached my grandparents, we told my grandmother what had happened, and she called our cousin who was in the tribal police force. We told everything to him after he showed up, and he said he would take care of it. I tried to forget about it, and after he retired from the force, I decided to ask what had happened, and if he indeed saw what I and M saw. All he mentioned was he did indeed see what we had described, also that they emptied the jars and dismantled the site. I wanted to know what was in the jars, and I pushed all I could, but he would not say. I don't remember, or leave it be is all he would tell me. Call me A. M is a nurse in Virginia now, and my cousin, may he rest in peace now. Here where I live, I have experienced some weird things, but to me, this was the one that set a bit of fear into me when I was young. I wonder what that doll was for, and what all those jars were. When I was 10, my parents had bought me a Furby for my birthday. It only said the same 3 phrases, over and over again. 1. I'm hungry. 2. I'm tired. 3. I love you. After a couple of months of the Furby not being played with, it kept opening its eyes and moving places while I slept. One day, the batteries finally died, and all it did was make a brrr sound. After taking out the batteries, it continued to make noises, so I ran a bath and tossed the Furby in it to try to shut it up. Then I ran over to our microwave and threw the Furby in there to be cooked. As it was being melted, its eyes and mouth flew open as if it was in shock at what I had just did. So this next encounter is a little bit later in life. I was at my ex's house a few years ago. Her sister and her were talking over a few cigarettes. When I walk out, her nephew's Furby he had on the table opened its eyes and started talking about a dark island, and the Furbies lived there in fear of what hid in the dark trying to eat them. Freaked out, we looked at each other to see if it had any batteries. Upon opening it up, we noticed no batteries were even in it, as it continued to say it was in emotional pain and wanted to rescue its friends. I grabbed the Furby and smashed it on the ground. I went into her shed and grabbed a shovel to smash the Furby some more and bury it in the backyard. After that, I have never owned another Furby again. I don't know what was making it malfunction or if it was possessed or what, but honestly, it's one of the creepiest things that I've ever experienced. The story I'm about to relay happened about 15 years ago when I was 6, so some of the details might have slipped through the cracks. However, I doubt I'll ever forget it. Every other weekend, my dad would take me to my mom's house for dinner. She was a headstrong Italian that took a lot of pride in cooking for her family. It was so funny to me because she had a car she never drove, a computer she never used, and a wine cellar that's been untouched for as long as I can remember. She walked everywhere, even with her groceries in hand. Unfortunately, as a result, the rest of the house appeared to be frozen in time. It looked like it was stuck in the 70s, collecting dust in the areas she didn't feel that needed to be gone in. Some of the wallpaper was starting to peel, and the bedrooms of her kids were starting to smell musty. Don't get me wrong, my mom was a fantastic woman and was far more active than most women at her age, but the house was too big for her, so it was impossible for her to take care of each corner. My cousins and I used to explore the little nooks and crannies that she had forgotten about. During one of our little excursions into the cellar, my cousin Georgia pulled out a Ouija board from a pile of old magazines and newspapers. I didn't have the foggiest clue what it was, so when my cousins Georgia, Annie, and Jonathan all told me I would be able to speak to ghosts with it, I was floored. It sounded scary, but it also sounded too cool to pass up. Georgia decided to perform the seance in the creepiest room of the house, the doll room. The doll room, as we called it, had to have been the most out-of-place room in the house. When my mom bought the house, it came with a wardrobe, a dimly lit painting of a man, and a built-in shelf for dolls of various sizes. No matter how many times we've wandered into that room, we could never understand why she had such a room. We turned the bedside lamp, set the board on the ground, and used a small glass cup in place of a planchette. Unsurprisingly, it was lost somewhere in the clutter. My cousins goofed around a little, pulling it around just to scare me. I remember growing a little frustrated and feeling stupid for believing that ghosts were even real. They laughed until we all heard the familiar sound of something rolling against wood. All three of them fell silent. Slowly we looked down at the cup. I could recall it once sat leisurely between the two letters, and now it sat firmly on the A. We exchanged baffled expressions for what felt like an eternity. I placed my hand on the glass, waiting for something to happen. Just when I was beginning to think it was somebody's foot knocking the glass around, I felt it jerking slightly to the right. I decided to push it in that general direction, thinking that something was trying to egg me on. My cousin started to snicker, thinking I was just pulling their legs. To this day, I argue with myself on whether it was just the power of suggestion or if something was really trying to contact me from the other side. I took my hand off the glass when we reached the letter L. Owl. We waited until we were content there wasn't going to be anything else following those two letters. Out of morbid curiosity, we asked Al how he died. My cousins placed their fingers back on the cup. Because they did, I'm not sure if they were just messing with me or if it was real. The word followed was fire. I remember Georgia nervously laughing and saying, "Okay, Al that died in the fire, do you want to talk to us?" The lamp flickered almost a greenish glow for a split second, lighting the room as a lightning bolt would have. We were frozen in our spots. This could have just been a fluke. The house was ancient, and it wasn't like Mom was a master technician. Maybe the bulb was dying. Suddenly, Jonathan yelped, smacking his arm as if swatting at a mosquito. He insisted something shocked him. At that point, we decided to call quits. We put the Ouija board back where we found it. Since there was news articles littered throughout the cellar, my cousins thought it would be a good idea to play detective to see if anything was there about a fire. After a few minutes, we grew bored of searching and ran back upstairs to tell the adults what we had found. Some of the adults glanced at each other with mock surprise and patronizing glances. My dad and uncle, however, seemed genuinely curious. On the road home, my dad told me an interesting tale. Without a hint of his typical humor or goofiness, he told me about when he was about 12 years old, living in Mom's house with his brother and sisters. He recalled it was a hot summer night, so everyone, save for his sisters, had their doors open to help maintain air circulation. His sisters always kept their bedroom door shut because it was fairly noisy, and sometimes would slam it shut if a sudden draft would reach in. He laid on top of his blankets, watching the ceiling fan go around when his peripherals caught something move in his doorway. When he looked, he noticed a silhouette of someone peering around at his height, glancing in his room before making it down the hallway. At first, he thought it was his brother, since the silhouette was coming from the opposite direction of the bathroom. My dad thought he could bust his big brother for being out of bed. He slinked into the hallway and saw the figure dart around the corner towards his sister's shared bedroom. From there, his brother wouldn't be able to hide. He turned the corner only to be met with his sister's bedroom door. That was the first time he claimed that all the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he suddenly felt very vulnerable. He turned around towards his brother's room and saw him sleeping right on top of his blankets. My dad didn't get any sleep that night. Up until that point, he never believed in ghosts. I'd be skeptical of his story if it wasn't for the fact that I could still hear the shock in his voice. My dad told me that the Ouija board could have been my cousins trying to scare me, but he also said he wouldn't doubt for a second if something was really trying to contact us. Let me start by giving a little background on myself and where I grew up. My name is Chris and I live in a small town in north-central North Carolina. This first story takes place on the farm where I grew up, and I was around 14 at the time. The land we owned was about 30 acres of mostly trees. In what is pretty much the center of the property stands this old tree. The tree is not and has never been dead, but it would never grow any leaves and always looked dead. This particular day, I had come home from school, and as usual, my dad had not gotten home from work yet, as he often didn't until around 7, sometimes even later. So, I had to entertain myself by finishing chores and eventually taking my dad's rifle, which is a simple .22 semi-auto, and walked the property. I hadn't the intention to actually hunt anything. The rifle was only for protection, even though a .22 isn't much, it did make me feel safer. Anyway, I walked all the way down to the end of the property and goofed around a little before I noticed the sun was going down. Knowing I needed to head back before the darkness set in, not because I could get lost because the path was very well beaten, so much you could probably drive a very large truck on it. But I wanted to get back because I wanted to be in the house before my dad got back. So on my way back I took a hastened pace. I began to hear footsteps in the trees to my left. I paid it little mind mostly because it was midsummer and the woods are full of critters, so I assumed it was a squirrel or something of the like. So I kept going. Keep in mind, my house is near the very front of the property, so it takes a long time to walk from the very back. As I kept going, I could hear the footsteps continue, but I noticed they were very loud and sounded very heavy. Now, these woods are very dense, but the trees are thin and spread out for about 50 or 60 yards, deep from the path, so you can see fairly well into the trees. I couldn't see anything that could have been making that much noise. Given how big the sound, you would think it would have been easy to spot, but there was nothing. I continued to walk, and of course as I continued, I did see the steps in the trees. At this point, I had enough and decided to stop and face the trees in the direction of the steps, not realizing where I was, which was almost perfectly in line with the aforementioned tree. I fired a few rounds into the woods and waited. I didn't hear anything, so I decided just to move more quickly to home. But as I turned and took a step towards home, the moment my foot touched the ground, I heard the voice of a woman whisper in my ear. Now, what truly terrified me is that I felt the heat of the breath in my ear. As soon as I did, my eyes did what I can only describe as the vertigo effect. It's a bit anticlimactic, but that terrified me for a very, very long time. My second story takes place on the same property but inside the house this time. A little backstory on the house, it was at least 100 years old. My dad told me that when we first moved there in the 90s, the house had no foundation or running water. Now, this day, I was around 12 years old, and I was on the second floor of the house looking through one of those closets out of boredom, and I stepped on one of my sister's old baby alive dolls, and it started crying, which made me jump up because I didn't see it and it was the last thing I was expecting. So, I picked it up and was going to take the batteries out so it would stop. When I turned the doll around and opened the Velcro that hid the batteries, I noticed that there were not only no batteries, but the entire housing for the battery pack was gone. And the moment I noticed this, it started crying even louder and began to wiggle. I freaked out and threw the doll back into the closet and ran down the stairs. As soon as I got to the stairs, I leaped from the top stair to the first floor in one bound and straight out the front door, where I stayed outside till my dad got home. We don't know what to do. It's getting so bad in the 20 years, and this is by far the worst. Both of my parents grew up in a haunted house, and of course my siblings and I have all grown up in a haunted house as well. At first, my parents thought my brother just had an imaginary friend, and his name was Joe, and he lived in the closet. My brother woke up screaming in the middle of the night. I was a baby, so I don't remember, but I've seen pictures. My parents ran in there, and he had blood all over his sheets and 3 very long cuts down his back. They had bunk beds, and my other brother was on the bottom. My parents said he was so pale he wouldn't even say a word. Things calmed down for a really long time until I was about 10. I had one of my friends staying over, and we were staying up really late playing games and doing what little girls do. We started to hear scratching coming outside of my door. I had a cat, so I thought it was her. I went to open it. But when I did, there was nothing there. So we shrugged it off. Then it started again, and the doorknob started to jiggle, and it slowly opened, and there was a dark figure standing there. It looked like it was out of breath, and its shoulders were going up and down. Then it lunged at us. We screamed, and my parents came running in. Nothing or nobody was in the house. She never stayed again, and stopped being my friend shortly after. 9 years later, just little things were happening, nothing too scary. My boyfriend, now husband, went off to basic, and I still lived with my parents. I was only 19. I had my dog Zeus, who was sleeping on my bed with me. He is a yellow lab. It was about 6:30 in the morning, and I had to be up at 8:30 for work. He woke me up by growling. Then I heard a weird voice in my ear speaking a language I didn't understand. When I started to open my eyes, it started growling in my ear. I opened my eyes fast and my door slammed. My dog was standing over me with his hair standing up, looking like he was about to attack something. Everyone was at work, and I heard banging around coming from my parents' room. I got Zeus off of me, jumped out of bed, and ran to my parents' room. Cabinets were opening and closing fast, and things were going thrown everywhere. All around the room, things were just being thrown. It wouldn't stop. I went running out of the door, and it slammed shut. My dog now was running around the house barking and growling. He started running into the door. I said F it, and ran out there and grabbed my work clothes, my dog, and got the heck out of there. I dropped my dog off at my friend's and went to work early. When I got home, my parents' room was destroyed. My mother was crying and my dad was pissed. I told them everything. We decided not to talk about it again and went on with the rest of the day. My brother still lived with my parents as well. The night my door kept opening and closing, I kept hearing something running in the hallway. Initially, I thought it was him. I slipped on my slippers and stomped to his room. I was going to yell at him and to tell him to knock off his stupid stuff, but when I opened the door, he was snoring. I woke him up and made him promise it wasn't him. He told me to leave his door open to see if anything changes. I'm halfway down the hallway. My brother yells at me to run to my room and to not look back. Of course, I turn around instead. As I turn around, I see a large black figure standing in this doorway, staring at me. It had large red eyes, just staring at me. I froze and started to whimper. My brother, being the protective big brother, came charging in, telling the thing to leave me alone, and when he got there, it disappeared. My brother ran to me and led me to my room, and slept on the floor that night to stay with me. I didn't get any sleep that night. Now, a year later, I'm 20. My husband is away for the army at the moment, and we are waiting for our plumbing to be done at our new house. Last night we had a bad rainstorm. I woke up to growling again, but I couldn't move. Out of the corner of my eye, there was a figure with red eyes just staring at me. Thunder started, and it opened its mouth so wide it could have fit my whole head in its mouth. It had huge sharp teeth and long skinny tongue. It started to scream, and my ears started to ring. I wanted to cover them, but I couldn't. My dog half growled and whined and started to bark. My parents came running in covering their ears but stopped in mid-run when they saw the thing. My dad came running to me, and picked me up and carried me out of the room. My dog followed. Zeus had his back to us so he could face the thing, and he never took his eyes off the figure until it was out of sight. I finally was able to move, and I started crying and shaking uncontrollably. My brother lives here as well as his girlfriend. We all heard her scream. Then she started banging on the door, so my dad opened it, and she came running in crying and shaking. We all started to ask where Mike is. Before she can answer, he came out of the room, on his hands and feet with black eyes, just staring at us. We all froze, none of us knowing what to do. My brother then popped his neck and started running for us. My dad slammed the door and locked it. My brother started running against it. He was a madman. My mom is screaming for it to get the hell out of her house, and just kept repeating this while throwing things and stomping. Then it goes quiet. My dad opened the door, and my brother was passed out on the floor, with the door with his nose bleeding. When my brother woke up, we told him everything. He didn't remember a thing. All he remembers was hearing screaming and that it all went black. He tells us sorry and then says he's going to stay quiet for the rest of the night. And there was no more activity that night either. Nobody slept last night. We all called in and tried to figure something out. Now it is the next night and it's 11 at night and we are hearing growling and scratching through the house. We can't do this again. Please, if anybody knows what's happening, help us. I'll keep you all updated as soon as I can. Thank you for sharing this on your channel. This was a paranormal story that happened to my mom when she was 9. She and her family lived on the outskirts of a small town in the Monterey Bay area in 1975. The house my mom lived in was on top of a hill with a winding road leading to it, facing a lake. There are no neighbors, and the other houses were a distance away. What my mom knew of the house was that it was built in 1927. It was an old white wooden Victorian house. She said it was completely off to be built in the hills far away from Watsonville, California, a small town about 25 minutes east of Santa Cruz. It started off as a community for immigrant workers who came here for a better life. She said that the rooms were big with plastered walls and massive windows in every room. It had been repainted many times. In the house's history, and the windows, they were all sealed shut. My mom recalled the windows were so high off the ground that you couldn't break into them. I'll warn you ahead that this is pretty disturbing, and if I sound dramatic, it's from my mom's point of view. So please bear with me. My grandparents worked far as they worked in the fields when my mom and her siblings moved to live in the United States from Mexico, and often left my mom and my tias and tios by themselves, with my older tia in charge. Mom and her siblings were used to being by themselves for long periods of time until my grandparents would come home from work. She says the property around the house had an old barn and a shed full of old rusty farming equipment. My mom and her siblings would spend the day exploring the nooks and crannies of the buildings, often pretending that they lived in those times and role-played. But often, Mom and her younger sister, Leticia, talked about strange things that would happen to one another, in or around the house. Tia Letty told my mom about the incidents that were happening to her. She would lie on her bed, looking up at a corner of the ceiling. She would tell my mom that she would see the corner was bellowing like it had lungs, and she is so scared that she would run out of the room. That is what Tia Letty's recollection of what happened to her was. But then, it was my mom's turn. One evening, my mom was in bed, facing the wall when she was sleeping. She always locked the door to her room. Being there in the dark by herself, she said she would be in a state where you're half asleep and half awake, but then she felt an ominous feeling. Weight on the edge of her bed. She was chilled with fear because she knew no one could possibly be in the room with her. She felt A motherly presence, she said, that was watching her as she slept. Mom wouldn't even dare to turn her head to look at whatever it was that was sat beside her on her bed. She was too scared to look at it because she thought she would die of fear if she saw what it was. She spent the whole night praying that it would go away and leave her alone. That was one of the many incidents that happened to her in that house. There was a second mysterious situation where my mom would hear knocks as if someone was there in the house with her. My mom would run to the door, excited that she heard knocks, but no one would be there. She said it happened at random, maybe 2 or 3 times in the day, any time that she was alone. She thought it was something pulling a prank, but it dawned on her that she had no neighbors for miles all around. That's when she became scared. Eventually, it stops, but it stayed with her. My mom was becoming increasingly more frightened because nothing would add up. She said she remembered that when the door knock stopped, there would be soft tappings between the walls. In the beginning, she thought she was hearing things and didn't pay much mind to it, but she constantly kept hearing those soft taps from inside the house. Day or night, it didn't matter. Mom didn't want to tell anybody because they would discount it as maybe her imagination was just working on overdrive. Her mind was slowly becoming fearful of what it could be. So, one night, my grandparents left to go food shopping in another town. My mom decided to stay by herself because she thought it was boring. But she completely forgot all about the things that were happening in the house. So later on, Mom was sitting in the living room because they had left early, and she was thinking in her mind that they would come home before dark. She was there in the living room all alone while it was completely pitch black outside. She said that all she heard was the frogs croaking by the lake and crickets chirping. Mom said she was getting a feeling that she was being watched through the windows, but the windows were so high for someone to look through. At that point, she was running around the house like a headless chicken on full panic mode. She was so scared. She made a bad decision that she regrets to this day, of staying all alone. Like if it couldn't get any worse for my poor mom, the tapping started again, but this time even louder than it ever has been before. My mom was thinking that she was becoming insane or something of that. She thought maybe she was losing her head. She decided to confront whatever it was, and with doing that, she started following the noise where the tappings were coming from. It was towards the very back end of the house near the back door. As she inched closer and closer, she put her ear against an inner wall of a small dark closet near the back door where the knocks were coming from inside. What she told me next gave me goosebumps typing this down. She said that she heard the loud wailing noise of a baby bawling and crying as if it was trapped inside the closet. Mom didn't even bother to check this because it shook her up. Then, for a quick moment, the tapping inside the house came back, but much louder as if it was banging on the door. She ran all the way into her room and locked the door. When she got her rosary, Mom waited for what felt like forever for her family to get home. After that, she never thought about staying home alone again. After my mom was done hearing things, now she said she would finally see what it was doing all this ruckus to her. Yet on another dark night in the middle of summer, Mom and her siblings were eagerly waiting for her mom and dad to come home from work. She ran to the back door, anticipating his arrival. The mom opened the door without hesitation, and she remembers that she was completely scared of what she saw. She says at a distance, almost close to her, she says that she saw a solid soul shaped like a woman, completely white, floating across the backyard, going from one corner of the old barn to the other corners, where old water sheds used to be standing, that was demolished right after my mom moved in. It was knocked down because my grandparents were concerned that the old dilapidated shed would cave in while my mom was playing in there with her brothers and sisters. When the woman reached the shed, she disappeared into thin air. My mom was speechless of what she saw and ran back into the house to tell my abuela. She couldn't even speak to my abuela, and after a while, when the fright left my mom, she told abuela of what it was. my abuela told my mom something chilling. Since my whole family was Catholic, and they kind of believed in the supernatural, my abuela thought that the ghost was a woman. Abuela thought that she could call her out and that the woman wouldn't stop trying to communicate with my mom. It's odd, because it just happened to her and only her, none of my other siblings. Abuela mentioned to my mom to say her, "What do you want next?" Mom complied, and when she did it, the woman never responded to her, and all the paranormal things stopped. Now that my mom told me this, she recalled that Tia Letty researched the house's history and freakishly found out that there were 5 children that lived in the house, just like my mom's family of 5. But if that wasn't scary enough, 4 of the 5 children's names were the exact same: Jose, Tio Jose; Anthony, Tio Anthony; Francisco, Tia Francisco, and then my mom's name, Maria. Disturbingly, one of the children were killed by a stray gunshot of a bullet in the house that was built in the 1920s. But the barn and the shed were built in the gold rush in California. I theorized that the woman thought my mom was the child who died in the house and wanted to contact her to see if it was her child. Just recently, last week, we went to Watsonville for a family event, and Tia Letty told that the house no longer stands, that it was demolished a couple of years ago. I grew up in a middle-class suburb/rural New England town. My mother was the essential soccer mom. Whatever interest I had, she found a coach for it. So, when it became clear that I wasn't going to lose interest in guns, she went out and found a coach so I would learn how to shoot properly and safely. The man she found was the husband of her friend. Let's call him Mr. NRA. He was an NRA certified instructor and avid hunter. He taught me all about firearms, and I, the trivia master about firearms, when I went to basic training some years later, but before then, I had gone to college. The end of my freshman year, I was called back to my hometown to attend Mr. NRA's funeral. His widow and 2 sons invited me to their place after the funeral. It had been decided that I should receive the Bane. You know, the bar from the US World War I and II Army frame. This one had been made in Europe for the Swedes in the 1920s and 6.5 Swedish. The markings stated that it entered the US in the early 1960s after being rechambered for 8mm Mausers and reduced to semi-auto only. Sometime between the 60s and the 80s, a hack rechambered it back to 6.5 Swedish. The end result was the former machine gun was then a bolt-action rifle. In 2 decades of tinkering, Mr. NRA had been able to get it working as a semi-automatic rifle. The family had come to the conclusion that I should have it and the stock of the 6.5 Swedish ammunition. This made sense, since that was the only gun in the chamber. So, I went back to school with a bolt-action bar, 3 cases of surplus ammo, and 7 hands loaded of hunting rounds. The next year, we had a 4-day weekend, and one of my friend's family had bought a hunting cabin on the edge of town that they lived in. This season started that Saturday, so Thursday night we left school and went to the cabin. Driving into town, it becomes clear that the grew sideways. The oldest part of the town was on one side, and the newest parts were stretching out to the other. The cabin was on the north side of the old side. It shared a driveway with the ruins of the church on the east side of the driveway, and the cemeteries were on the west side. The cabin was on the south end of the property, some 100 yards behind where the church had been and the historical society notice. We got there right about twilight and started unpacking the trucks. By the time we finished setting up the cabin, it was dark. I went out to my SUV and noticed someone in the driveway by the road. It looked like a girl watching me. I didn't think much of it, since there were a few houses around. One of my friends came out and asked what I was looking at. I told him, and the first thing he asked was, "By girl, are we talking minor or college-age cutie?" I called him a Romeo wannabe and finished what I was doing, Friday during the day, we got up, ate, and after some screwing around, we took the half-mile walk out to the hunting grounds. We noted by the signs, marking it a private property for hunting signs by Romeo's father and the local game warden. We scouted around, but didn't find much in the way of deer track, and oddly enough, not much in the way of chipmunk either. Now, anyone who has spent time in the woods in New England knows that it is about impossible not to see chipmunks in the early fall. Around lunchtime, we headed back to the cabin, and as we got there, we decided to go check out the church and the cemeteries. When we got there, I expected that the one by the road was the older one and the one behind it was the newer one, since the first one had a wall around it. But a sign put up by the Historical Society informed us that the two were the same age. The one in the wall was consecrated holy ground, and the second one next to it was one for the damned. Whore, suicides, convicted criminals, and etc., who hadn't confessed, and other immoral people in the colonial era. The sign also told the story of the church burning down between the election of Lincoln and the start of the Civil War, after being struck by lightning. The story finished with the note about the town voting against Lincoln because they didn't want to push for the abolition, and after the church was struck by lightning, practically the whole town enlisted in the Union Army. While I read this Dumb and Dumber were going over tracks in the dirt driveway, they called me and Romeo over and pointed them out. A barefoot woman walked out of the sinner's graveyard, walked down the driveway towards us for a few yards, and then went back into the graveyard. I figured that it was some weirdo who had gone into the church graveyard, then hopped the stone wall into the sinners and came to check us out. We went back to the cabin and got our stuff ready since we would be getting up early so we could get to our hunting spot at the crack of dawn. We spent the afternoon gearing up and joking around. Saturday was a bust. Collectively, we all saw one deer that day, a doe with an interesting set of scars on its left side. We walked out into the woods trading stories and pictures some of us had taken of the deer. By the time we got to the cabin, it was dark out, and I could have sworn that I saw a figure creeping in the sinner's graveyard. We only had Sunday, since we have to be back to school on Monday. Sunday, we went out early and stayed out as late as possible, so it was dark before we left the woods. As we walked out of the woods, we spotted the girl in the driveway. Romeo handed his rifle to Dummer and started jogging down the driveway. We made snarky comments about ourselves and started to head into the cabin. We paused to unload our rifles. That was when we heard the scream. The girl was trying to take a chomp out of Romeo like a zombie. Dumb and Dumber rushed to help Romeo while I reloaded my rifle. Dumb and Dumber knocked the girl off Romeo with their rifles. They knocked her to the ground and then started putting rounds into her with no effect. When I ran up, she seemed to panic. I swung Bane on target and put one round into her chest, just missing her heart. She screeched when I shot her and ran off into the graveyard. It was right about that point that police showed up. They told us to get on the ground and demanded to know what was going on. We told them that some girl attacked our friend and we had gotten to defend him. Two of the cops went to search the graveyard while two stayed with us. One of the officers checked Romeo and called for an ambulance. The two officers searching the graveyard came back and said they found a trail that led to the oldest of the sinners' graves, but it disappeared. We were taken to the police station and questioned. I got grilled over the ammo I used. Late the next day, we were released after someone had come forward to give a statement that backed up our account of events. Romeo spent the next 2 weeks in the hospital. He had been bitten by a human, and the bite became infected. The DA contacted me multiple times, and while the DA's office decided not to press charges against us, the case remains open since the girl was never found. I am a half-white, half-Mexican-American woman. I visited Mexico for the first time when I was 10, and my sister was 8. We went to Cancun. We went with my mom and grandma one night into town away from the resort. They speak Spanish, so we felt comfortable. I remember there were dirt roads and young children selling gum. My family came across a table in front of a store with lots of silver jewelry sprawled across it. I'm not sure where the rain stick came from, whether it was sitting on the table or someone else walked up with it. I just remember a Mexican showing the handmade rain stick to my little sister, and after a minute, my grandma gave some pesos to the person for it. It was 1.5 inches wide and about 13 inches long. It was cylinder-shaped and made of wood, flat on the ends. It looked really old and worn, but it was sturdy. There were 3 colorful bands of twine on each end. If you tilted it slowly to either side, it sounded just like rainfall. I assumed there was rice inside hitting the sticks as it fell down. We went back to the hotel with our newfound trinkets. Fast forward to when I was 18 in 2007, my mom and I were living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Plano, Texas. My sister was living in Michigan with our father. The computer desk was right next to my bed. There was a shelf on the other side of the bed with pictures on it. My mom had been going through old belongings and placed the rain stick on the left side of the shelf. I was sitting on the bed and my mom was sitting on the front of the desk. I was bored and picked up the rain stick to hear the soothing sound of rain and bring back memories of my childhood. I thought it would be fun to start shaking it like an instrument and made a musical beat. As soon as I did that, I was in front of a fire in a circle of black people wearing little clothing. We were all sitting, surrounded by tall grass. No buildings, just out in nature. Their appearance was more shadowy when I say black, and the feeling that this was some sort of weird tribal or cult thing. I was playing the rain stick, shaking it, while some were chanting a foreign language. I did not recognize them. I noticed my hands were starting to turn shadowy black as well. I was back on the bed and my mom and I smelled smoke. It smelled like there was a fire burning in the apartment. We then witnessed a white fog slither up and out of the rain stick. We screamed at the top of our lungs. We ran out of the apartment as I dropped the stick. We calmed down each other, thinking about what we should do. I told her about the vision I had while playing the rain stick. She decided we needed to find a curandera and a curandero. They clear spirits from houses. We figured it had been used for voodoo or something and wondered where this thing originated from. We realized that we didn't know exactly how old the thing was and how many people had owned it before us. We prayed that whatever came out of the stick didn't follow us to the car. We were freaked out, scrambling through a phone book seeking a curandera. We drove to the Mexican side of town, desperately seeking a curandera, but it was just past 10 p.m. and all the spirit and psychic shops were closed. We built up enough courage to return home. The smell of campfire was gone. I called this musician I was dating at the time. His mom was a very well-respected psychic in Dallas. He told me to wrap the stick in a red material and place it in the closet next to the front door. After 2 hours, me and my mama bear felt uncomfortable with it still in the house and placed it right outside our front gate. The next day, one of my sister's friends came by, a Native American man who was referred to as Ashtray. He knew I liked smoking ganja and he brought a joint. I asked if he could get a bag of bud for me. He mentioned he was hanging with a friend that night, but had not brought him over because we didn't know him. Ashtray left to go get me my sack. I left to walk 2 buildings over to hang with this hot guy I knew while I waited. I noticed at the building facing ours, there was a dude about 16 years old, standing behind the staircase staring at our apartment. I assumed it was Ashtray's friend waiting for him to come back. I said, "You don't have to wait out there, dude. You can come in." He didn't say anything, and came inside. We were chilling, watching TV. Ashtray returned with his dime bag, and we all got stoned. Eventually, the dude I found behind the stairs said he had to take off. He left and asked Ashtray how they'd been friends. He told me that he didn't know who that guy was, and the friend he said that he was hanging out didn't want to come the whole time. I was pretty freaked out and told my mom about it. All 3 of us opened the door and noticed the rain stick was gone. We know that creepy guy probably took it. My sister came back from Michigan the next day. I described the guy from the stairs and she knew who I was talking about. A week later she informed me that he hadn't been at the school for several days and his parents were looking for him. I had a feeling that it had something to do with him stealing our haunted rain stick. This happened 2 years ago in a small town in Eastern Europe. I was 18 at the time, freshly graduated from high school. Well, our town is surrounded by woods, so if you follow a random road, there are high chances that you will end up on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, which isn't even on Google Maps. My friend and I were very adventurous because we were dumb teens and we had a license, so being that our town had a very few and boring places to hang out, we pretty much explored all the country dirt roads. One night in August, we decided to go on a night drive to a place we had been before. We liked the fact that we had never seen a car driving there, so we would smoke, drink, and blast music without disturbing anyone. We named the place the Botanical Garden, simply because it was 20 miles away, on a road surrounded by undisturbed forest on both sides. We were 2 carfuls of people. I was driving mine and Elena with hers. We arrived at the place at around 11 p.m., and we started doing our usual dumb things. As a matter of fact, I don't smoke, and I couldn't drink since I was the driver, so I don't think I imagined what happened next. We were just laughing like idiots when Elena turned the music volume down a little and told us to be quiet. We asked why, but she didn't respond. She was focused on hearing something. "Guys, you didn't hear that?" "Hear what?" we asked her. She explained to us that she went a little close to the woods and heard something like a crying woman. She was genuinely scared. I could see that on her face. While I was telling her that it was most likely a fox or an animal, and she mistook the sound, a few of my high and drunk friends started bluffing, screaming at whatever it was to go away, that we would beat the shit out of it. Suddenly, we began hearing rhythmic screams, like 10 seconds away from each other. But what really scared me was that every scream sounded closer to us. Well, to be honest, I really thought there was someone that needed help, but those screams were something scarier than anything I've ever seen in a horror movie. I can still hear it sometimes in my nightmares today. I know we were dumb, but we didn't move a muscle. I don't know why we were just staring at each other, not saying anything with our scared faces. I think it was the fact that we were like 10 people, and we only had pepper spray on us in case we ran into somebody we didn't know. The girls were the first who made a dash for the cars, followed by everyone soon after. I turned my car, and was turning on the headlights. I could see someone standing in the woods behind a tree. It looked like a woman, but very old. She was hunched and had some kind of walking stick. I can't remember what she was wearing, but her whole face was covered, and I couldn't stay long because my friends were screaming at me to floor it, so I did. We drove back to town and we stopped at a gas station to gather our thoughts. Everyone was puzzled and everyone saw that old woman. The friends in the car behind us even said the old woman got out of the woods and was chasing after the car. I have absolutely no idea what we saw. I haven't been back there at night. We talked to other friends and we told them what we experienced, and the group really went there to see that for themselves. All I say is that they hesitated to tell us what went down. They just told us that they were too creeped out and booked it out of there very soon. I don't know if we saw some kind of spirit or demented woman, or if it was some sick, well-made prank, but I really doubt it was a prank, because people usually don't even know of this place. Remember, we've been there dozens of times and haven't seen a single car pass by ever. People here don't do this kind of things, and even if they do, surely not in the middle of goddamn nowhere. This isn't the United States. Random people dressing up like clowns and stuff like that don't go out in the woods. Our folklore has many legends about spirits that haunt the woods at night. Stories that my grandma was telling me when I was a child that I never believed. But I think I'll believe now. This story takes place in South Carolina, at Fort Jackson. When I went to basic training, it was as I expected it to be. Drill sergeants yelling and smoking you on a daily basis. However, there was one drill sergeant who seemed to be a bit off compared to the rest of them. One day, We were washing our gear outside after coming back from a 12-mile ruck march. The drill comes outside carrying what seemed to be a baby, except that it wasn't. It was a doll, pale and in a black suit. She kept rocking it in her arms and giving us death stares. She would even talk to it. Fast forward to a week later, we were getting smoked for someone dropping their ride. I mean, running around our barracks in endless circles. When we were done, we formed up, and well, let's just say that we have a mannequin, and which we use as punishment to carry around. It weighs around 180 pounds and is definitely a burden. So when my battle buddy and I were at our barracks, we looked up, and we see the mannequin looking out the window, staring at us and moving its shoulders, which is just impossible. Keep in mind that we didn't even leave it near the window or anything. To make things worse, there was no one inside. Everyone was outside. Now that I think about it, there might be a connection between the drill sergeant's doll and that mannequin. I don't know. It was definitely creepy, and I've never experienced anything remotely similar to it since. So this is a story that took place when I was around 8 years old in my old neighborhood. I was next door neighbors with my best friend Alex. We both went to the same school and always hung out every day after school. One day I was bringing my Nintendo 64 to his house so we could play together. Once I got into the house, his uncle was there watching the TV so we couldn't use it. Today, I now know that he wasn't his uncle because my older sibling, which knew Alex's older sibling, told me that his parents rented out rooms to random people from their original hometown. So, the quote-unquote uncle was just a random stranger from out of the country. He told us to go into his shed to search for an extra TV, so we opened the shed and started searching. We found an older TV, but we could use it. Then, something started moving all the things around, and we thought it was a rat so we didn't mind at first. Then we heard laughter. Something so scary that I tried to leave, but Alex told me not to worry. We kept searching around for the laughter and we eventually found this one male doll that was around 2 feet long. It was all torn and battered, so we figured it was just broken. We just sat it down and decided to go hook up the TV in his room. We played for a while until his uncle left the house for food and his parents were at work, so we were home alone. We started hearing noises at the house, but figured it was nothing. But then, we heard that same distinct laughter. The doll was moving around the house carefully, which we saw through the small peek underneath the closed door. The doll was looking for something, which was probably us if I had to guess. We were both freaking out, but we knew we had to get away from the house. We opened the window and jumped out and ran towards my house. The doll managed to somehow look at us as we were running away, through the window and just laugh. We stayed at my house all afternoon until his parents came home. Ever since that day, I have always experienced weird things in my friend's house, like having YouTube videos end abruptly and start playing other random things like clown videos, which I think it is a cereal commercial from the 70s. I ignored all these weird signs for the rest of my childhood, and recently we have met up for the first time in a long time. I don't think we've met up since departing and going to different high schools. Somehow, the topic of weird things was brought up and I asked if he remembered all those things. He did remember. As an 8-year-old child, I was given an old porcelain doll by a very dear family friend, Miss Marion. She was always coming across things and giving them to me. This doll was the last thing she ever did give to me though. I was never really into dolls at all growing up, but I took the doll and placed her in my room in a small child-sized rocking chair. The doll sat next to my closet and dresser, right beside my nightlight. The doll was very pretty. She was dressed in peach and cream colored dress, with an apron and petticoats. She had little black Mary Jane shoes that when removed showed her delicately painted toenails. Her body was soft. Only her head, forearms, hands, and legs from the knee down were porcelain. Her limbs were pink. Her dark brown hair hung in slightly frizzed and now loose curls. Her eyes were brown. Her cheeks were a rosy peach color, all like mine. Miss Marion made a point of saying the doll reminded her of me, which is why she gave her to me. From the moment that doll, I named her Claire, came into my house, things began to happen. I was always uneasy with Claire. I never wanted to touch her, and when I played in my room, it was as if she watched me. It wasn't anything to panic about, but I do remember feeling like if I did something wrong, she might actually tell on me. How ridiculous does that sound? The first real occurrence I remember was when I was reading in my room, ghost stories if you can believe that, when a musical carousel horse that sat on my dresser began to play. Not just a couple of notes, like an old mechanical music box will do at times, but like someone just wound it up fully and let it go. I sat stunned and stared at the little horse, and it moved up and down in time with the music. Then, it just stopped. Not wound down or anything, but just suddenly stopped. I was a pretty brave kid. I didn't run and I didn't tell my mom. I used to see a shadow man in the hallway or in my parents' bedroom door all my growing up years, and if she didn't believe me about that, she definitely wouldn't believe me about any mundane thing such as a music box playing on its own. So I just let it go. The next thing that happened was the voice. For several nights and into these years, I was awoken by what sounded like a woman inches from my face shouting my name. I jump and sit up and find my room empty. Those happenings died down after a few months though. She then started to plague my little brother with the same thing, and now that he and I are grown up and gone, she's moved on to my dad. The little thing started to get to me. I'd put something in a certain place only to find it later on the floor or on my dresser, right next to Claire. All my missing items eventually turned up around her. Once a ring ended up in a pocket of her apron. Books would fall off my shelves and a perfume smell would sometimes fill my room. The doll itself didn't smell at all, but the air around her would. My catalyst to finally get Claire out of my room was the night that I woke up after hearing thumping around my closet. I opened my eyes, sat up in bed, and of course my eyes were drawn to the nightlight where Claire sat. As I watched, the source of thumping became clear. The rocking chair Claire occupied was rocking on its own. I had thick shag carpet, so there is no way it was rocking just by chance. If that wasn't enough, Claire's feet, which were both turned to the side facing opposite each other, slowly straightened themselves to both be pointing directly up. This part still freaks me out 20 years later. She then turned her head, which was quite impossible to do since it was attached fixed to her clothed body. She looked towards me, and every music box in the room, all 4 of them, started to play at once. I was frozen with fear. I didn't feel endangered so much as I felt scared of what was happening. A scream from my mom and dad. The music stopped, but Claire maintained her gaze in my direction. And this is why I hate dolls. Even after that, I couldn't get rid of Claire totally. I ended up stuffing her in a box in the back of a storage closet. She's still there as far as I know. So is the woman who now screams my dad's name in the middle of the night, and not in a kinky way, while I think she explained some of the oddities that happened in my parents' house, I don't think she is the tie to it all, especially with the Shadow Man. My friend Tim Weisberg is a paranormal radio podcast host of the show Spooky South Coast, and also an author. He asked me to lend him Claire once. He heard my story back in 2011. I obliged, and Claire went to stay with him for a few months. He wrote about his experiences with Claire while she stayed with him in the book Haunted Objects that I mentioned earlier. Temperature changes in the room she stayed in along with hearing voices were 2 of his note encounters. Claire also stayed briefly at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast in 2012. The guys from the Haunted Towns show encountered some things in my parents' house while Claire was with them. She now lives at my friend's old haunted house. He is a Haungan, so he and his love, along with house's other spirits, tend to keep her in line. My daughter has several old porcelain dolls. When she was 9, she got a sudden interest in them. I had never bought them for her because they are very often very delicate and I didn't want her to break them. I took her to the Goodwill and she begged for one. I let her buy it since she takes care of her things good, so why not? I quickly noticed something was different in my house. I felt like I was being watched from every corner. Shortly after that, she asked for another doll at the Goodwill. Over the years, she has collected 3. I noticed she was very careful about which one she picked. She treats the dolls like gold and keeps them sitting up on the corner of her bed. She tells me the dolls like me since I'm so careful with them when I move them or make her bed. I see shadows around my house and I hear soft voices. Nothing makes me feel in danger and I'm getting used to it, but it's just freaky. None of this stuff really started until after these dolls came in the house though, and that's why I do think that they do have spirits inside of them or something like that. Any thoughts would be very much appreciated. I know this is really weird, but I've always been obsessed with the idea of having a haunted item. So I went on eBay and did a very thorough search on trusted sellers and stores where I could buy haunted items. I eventually settled on my doll Evelyn, because the seller stated that the vessel was inhabited by the spirit, Evelyn, who died at 17 and had hopes of going to college and being a teacher. I felt a connection to her, because I am currently a senior at university and about to start working as an English teacher. I hope to read to Evelyn often and ask her advice for my lesson plans. I even am interested about giving her a place in the classroom to sit so she can still achieve her dreams. So after the first day and night with Evelyn, I only have a couple out of ordinary things to report. First, my cat won't stop rubbing against the doll or sniffing it. And second, I fell asleep last night with my TV on watching South Park on Hulu, which means my DVD player was on too. I woke up at about 1 a.m. to both of those things being shut off. Now I know there's probably a logical explanation for that, but I'm just hoping it's her. On my second day and night, nothing happened last night that I know of, but I woke up at 2 a.m. for no reason, but that's becoming typical for me anyway. But today, as I was getting ready for class, I turned on a paranormal story time on YouTube, and right after, my door that had been shut opened by itself about a quarter of the way. My cat and I both shot our heads up to the door when it happened. When I know, I will probably sound dumb for this, but I used the Ghost Radar app and it said there was an entity right in the direction where my door is. Now, this doesn't prove Evelyn is a haunted doll, but I do think there's something off about her. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed these stories, please hit that like button. If you're new to the channel, why not subscribe, turn on notifications to never miss a new video, as I upload them almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you don't like watching YouTube videos, why not check out my iTunes and Spotify playlist? I have a podcast on there where you can find these stories and exclusive stories you won't find on the channel, posted almost every single day. So, there's that. I'll put that link in the description down below. If you have a story you'd like to share in a future video, be sure to send it in at swampdweller.net or the email that you can also find in the description down below. I very much appreciate all your guys' support, and I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.